The back kitchen door of the Rowe estate didn't just close behind him. It clicked shut with the specific, deliberate weight of a man who already knew he wasn't alone. Lyra Macpherson went completely still. The bag of frozen blueberries she'd wrapped in a dish towel slipped from her fingers and landed on the limestone floor with a soft, devastating thud. She had been convinced she was the only person awake in the house. At 2:15 in the morning, the Muskoka estate was as silent as the dark water of the bay beyond its walls. She had come to the kitchen for the same reason she always came when sleep abandoned her. Because the kitchen was the one place in this enormous, unsettling house where she understood the rules. She knew exactly where everything was. She knew which burners ran hot, which oven sealed slightly off, which shelf held the sea salt, and which held the Himalayan pink. The kitchen was hers in a way that nothing else about her life had been for a very long time. But the man now standing just inside the doorway, still in a charcoal suit at this hour, his dark eyes cutting straight through the amber gloom to the left side of her face. He was not a man who operated by anyone else's rules. Caspian Rowe. She had worked in his estate for 8 months and had managed to be almost entirely invisible to him. That was, after all, the whole point. He didn't say anything immediately. He didn't step further into the room. He simply looked at her, or rather, at the bloom of bruised purple spreading from the corner of her jaw toward her cheekbone. The mark was fresh enough that it still radiated heat. His voice was low, unhurried. Worse, somehow, for how quiet it was. Lyra Macpherson had not planned to spend the year she turned 26 working as a private estate cook for one of the most dangerous men in the country. 2 years earlier, she had been finishing her culinary management diploma at George Brown College in Toronto, working double shifts at a Yorkville restaurant on weekends, saving toward the lease on a small bakery space on Dundas West. She had a plan. She had a waiting list of investors. She had a brother named Aidan who could make her laugh so hard her ribs ached. Then Aidan, 20 years old and biking home from a night shift at the auto shop where he worked, was hit by a vehicle that didn't stop. The driver was never identified. The car, according to the single traffic camera that caught a fragment of the plate, was registered to a numbered corporation that dissolved 6 weeks later. Aidan survived, barely. Spinal compression. Months of rehabilitation. Then more months. The bills arrived the way catastrophe always does, quietly at first, then all at once. Lyra's savings went first. Then her parents' retirement fund. Then a loan she couldn't service. The bakery plan became something she thought about only very late at night, in the way you think about a version of yourself that no longer exists. A woman from a private staffing agency had found her, not the other way around. The woman had heard Lyra's name from a chef in Yorkville. The position was live-in, she explained. The pay was extraordinary. The discretion requirements were absolute. The estate, she was told, belonged to a business executive. Lyra found out on her 3rd day exactly what kind of business Caspian Rowe actually ran. She found out the way you find out things in a house like that. Not by being told, but by learning to read silence, to understand what wasn't said at dinner, to count the number of men in tailored jackets positioned at the corners of the driveway. She stayed, because Aidan's next round of treatment had already been scheduled, and the bill was already printed. The rule given to her on her first day by Mrs. Sutcliffe, the estate's head of household, a woman with the posture of a weather vane in a strong wind and the warmth to match, was simple. You are here to cook, nothing else. You don't look for things that aren't your business. You don't hear conversations that weren't meant for you. You don't exist outside this kitchen unless you're told otherwise. Lyra had followed that rule with perfect precision for 8 months. Until the night she made the mistake of going out to the kitchen garden at the rear of the property, past the stone wall where the thermal cameras had a 40-second gap in their rotation to check on the rosemary she'd planted in early spring. The man who had been waiting there knew about the camera gap. That alone told her he hadn't come in over the fence. His name, she would learn later, was Bram Hardy. At the time, all she knew was that he smelled of cigarette smoke and the particular cologne that men wear when they want to seem like more than they are. He grabbed her by the upper arm before she even saw him properly. He shoved her back against the stone wall hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. "You've been asking questions," he said, not loudly, conversationally almost, about the hit and run on Pape Avenue, about the car, about who it belonged to. "I don't know what you're." He hit her across the face with the back of his hand. Her head snapped sideways. The pain came a half-second later, blooming wide and hot across her jaw. "Stop asking," he said. Then he walked back through the gap in the stone wall and disappeared into the dark. Lyra sank slowly onto the damp flagstones and pressed her hand to the side of her face and tried to remember how to breathe. She didn't go back to her room. She couldn't bear the smallness of it, the isolation. She went to the kitchen instead, because she always went to the kitchen, and she pressed frozen blueberries against her jaw, and she cried in the particular muffled way of someone who has learned that crying out loud achieves nothing. She did not hear Caspian come in. "It was nothing," Lyra said. "I walked into the corner of the pantry door, and I'm fine." Caspian didn't move from where he stood. He had one hand resting loosely on the kitchen island, his suit jacket slung over his arm. He looked, she thought, like a man who had just come from something that hadn't gone particularly well, though there was no evidence of it on him. Just a slight tension around the jaw, a loosened collar button, the faintest smell of wood smoke and cold air. "The corner of a door," he repeated. "Yes." He took a slow breath through his nose. "I have been in rooms where men have tried to convince me of far more elaborate things than that." He set his jacket down on the nearest stool. "The shape of that bruise is not from a corner." Lyra said nothing. He crossed the kitchen without hurrying, stopping on the other side of the island from her, close enough now that she had to work to hold her ground. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, and the kitchen, which had always felt spacious to her, seemed to rearrange itself around him. "Look at me," he said quietly. She did. Up close, his eyes were darker than she had realized. She had seen him in passing, emerging from the study, disappearing into the black Suburban idling in the drive, standing at the window of the upper library with his back to the room. But she had never been asked to look directly at him before. He studied the bruise the way a person studies something they intend to account for fully. "Someone struck you," he said, "on this property." She couldn't think of an answer that was both untrue and convincing, and she was too exhausted to construct one carefully. "His name was Bram Hardy," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had expected. "He said I'd been asking questions about a hit-and-run on Pape Avenue 2 years ago. He told me to stop." Something shifted in Caspian's expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a very precise calculation being rapidly performed. "Why were you asking questions about a hit-and-run?" "Because the car that hit my brother was never found." She met his eyes. A camera caught part of the plate. The plate traced to a numbered corporation that dissolved 6 weeks later. "I hired someone to keep digging. Hardy seemed to know that." The silence in the kitchen lasted long enough that she could hear the refrigerator's low hum and the distant lap of the bay against the dock. "And you believe the plate traces back to me," Caspian said. "I believe it traces back to a corporation I can't identify." She paused. "I don't know who owned it." He studied her for a long moment. Then he turned slightly, not away from her but to one side, and his jaw tightened by a fraction. "Bram Hardy works the Eastern portfolio for the Kincaid faction. Debt collection, cargo interference. He has no business within 50 meters of this property." He said it the way you'd say any plainly factual thing. "For him to know about the camera rotation gap in the stone garden wall." He stopped. Lyra watched his face. "He didn't climb the fence," Caspian said quietly, more to himself than to her. "No," she agreed. "He was already inside when I got there." He looked at her then with a quality of attention that made her feel very seen in the least comfortable possible way. "You understood the implication of that?" "Yes." "And you told me anyway." "You already knew the bruise wasn't from a door." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his jacket from the stool, not to put it on, and she saw what the jacket had been concealing: a shoulder holster, a matte black handgun with a textured grip, worn as casually as a watch. "Stay in this kitchen," he said. He pulled out a slim encrypted phone and dialed a single number. When it answered, he said only, "Corvin, wake everyone. I want Orrin, Hatch and Aldred in the Situation Room in 15 minutes. Full estate lockdown, nothing moves in or out." He ended the call. He looked at her once more, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite name. Not warmth exactly, but its careful, distant cousin. "Someone on my staff opened that gate for Hardy," he said. "Which means tonight just became considerably more complicated than a bruised jaw." What happened in the next 2 hours Lyra understood only in pieces. The estate shifted the way a body shifts from sleep into alert wakefulness. Not gradually, but all at once and completely. Steel shutters descended over the ground floor windows with a seamless mechanical precision that suggested they had been designed for exactly this. Men she had only ever glimpsed at the edge of things materialized in the corridors, quiet and purposeful, carrying equipment she preferred not to inventory too closely. Corvin, Caspian's right hand, a compact, still-faced man who Lyra had previously known only as the person who left coffee orders on the kitchen counter, escorted her from the kitchen to the private study with a politeness that was also clearly non-negotiable. The study smelled of aged paper, cedar, and something bitter like cold espresso left too long. Shelves climbed to the ceiling. A wide desk of dark wood dominated the center of the room. A leather armchair sat near the window, the blind drawn. "Sit. He won't be long." She sat. She drew her knees to her chest and listened to the sounds of the house reorganizing itself around some invisible emergency she had apparently set into motion. 20 minutes later, Caspian returned. He had removed the holster but rolled his sleeves to the elbow, and there was a quality of focused, contained intensity about him that reminded her, absurdly, of the way heat pools in cast iron before it becomes visible. He went directly to the credenza near the window and retrieved a first aid kit, a proper one, the kind that belonged in a clinic, not a household drawer. He crouched in front of her chair without ceremony and opened it. "This will sting," he said, tearing open an antiseptic wipe. It did. She didn't make a sound. He worked carefully, which was the thing she hadn't anticipated. His hands were large and bore the particular kind of scarring that doesn't come from kitchens or offices, and yet he touched the bruise with the deliberate gentleness of someone who understood exactly how much pressure was too much. "Orrin Hatch," he said as he applied arnica gel to the worst of the swelling, "has been my logistics coordinator for 6 years. He manages the estate's access systems, among other things." He didn't look up from her face. "The gate override log from tonight carries his biometric signature." He let Hardy in. Caspian sat back on his heels. "Orrin has been redirecting payments from 3 of my subsidiary accounts for the better part of a year. The Kincaid faction holds his debt. He gave them access to my property tonight in exchange for a reduction of what he owes." He paused. He apparently calculated that allowing a mid-level enforcer to intimidate a member of my kitchen staff was a small enough transgression to go unnoticed. And it wasn't. It was not. He closed the kit. "The bruise on your face is the reason it wasn't." She looked at him. "What happens to Orrin?" He held her gaze for a moment. "That's not a question I'll answer in a way that makes either of us feel better." He stood. "What I will tell you is this. No one in this house touches what is mine without consequence. You work on this property. That makes you mine to account for." The word "mine" landed in the room and stayed there. "My brother's debt," she said, the question she had been holding since the kitchen. "Aiden's medical bills. The numbered corporation that registered the car that hit him, was that connected to you?" Caspian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was even, but something behind it was not. "The corporation was registered by a man who managed several of my holding accounts. He used it for purposes I was not aware of and is no longer alive to answer for it." He paused. "I cannot give you back 2 years. What I can tell you is that Aiden's debt will be erased by morning, and that he will be moved tonight to a private rehabilitation facility in Collingwood, under a name the Kincaid network doesn't know, with 2 of my people on the door." Lyra's throat tightened so abruptly she couldn't speak. "You've been paying his bills with your salary here," Caspian said quietly. "It wasn't a question." She nodded. "That ends tonight." A knock at the study door. Corvin's voice muted through heavy wood. "Boss, Orrin is in the situation room. Aldred's there too." Caspian straightened his cuffs. "Stay in this chair," he said. "Don't move until I come back." He was gone for 11 minutes, Lyra counted. When he returned, he poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass from the credenza and drank it standing with his back to her, then set the glass down carefully. "The matter with Orrin has been resolved," he said. She didn't ask how. The morning came with pale gold light through the gap in the heavy curtains and the sound of the bay and the smell of coffee she hadn't made. Mrs. Sutcliffe appeared at the door of the guest room where Lyra had spent the remainder of the night. Her posture impeccable, and her tone sanded down to something resembling civility. "Mr. Rowe asks that you join him in the solarium when you're ready." She set a tray on the nightstand, Earl Grey, buttered toast, and a set of clean clothes that were manifestly not a cook's uniform. "Your brother was transferred at 4 this morning," he settled. Lyra sat up. The bruise on her jaw had deepened overnight, but the swelling had come down. "Mrs. Sutcliffe." She stopped the woman at the door. "How many people know what happened last night?" The older woman turned, something cautious moving behind her eyes. "What Mr. Rowe chooses to share is his own business. The staff know the estate went into lockdown. They don't know why." "And Aldred? Where is he this morning?" "Mr. Aldred is reviewing communications logs from the situation room. Mr. Rowe's orders." The housekeeper paused. "He's been there since 6. Lyra filed that away and said nothing. The solarium was all glass and Georgian Bay, a long room overlooking the dock and the pewter grey water beyond. Caspian stood at a teak table covered in maps and printed satellite images. Corvin beside him, both men speaking quietly. When she entered, they stopped. Corvin offered a brief, formal nod, the kind of acknowledgement she would have received from no one in this house 48 hours ago. Caspian looked at her, then at the bruise, then at her eyes. He said, "This involves you." She sat. He laid out what she came to understand was the shape of a war, delivered with the measured calm of a man briefing a board of directors. The Kincaid faction had grown comfortable along the eastern end of the province. They had acquired influence in 2 municipal offices. They had read Caspian's long-standing patience as weakness. They had sent a man onto his property and put their hand on a woman who worked under his roof. "We move tonight," he said, his pen tracing 3 points across the map. Kincaid's primary money laundering channel runs through a freight brokerage on the lakeshore. Corvin takes that. Their communications infrastructure is housed in a building they own near the junction. We collapse it, and their senior field coordinator will be persuaded to reconsider his loyalties. He glanced at her. He didn't ask whether she was frightened. He didn't insulate her from any of it. He angled his body toward her as he spoke. "The way you speak to someone you've decided is no longer furniture." "You started a war over me," she said quietly. "I started a war," he said, "because the Kincaids have been pushing for 18 months and I have held back for 18 months. And last night they put their hands on someone I am responsible for." He set the pen down. "You were the reason I could no longer look the other way. That is not the same as being the cause." At 4:30 that afternoon, Lyra was in the kitchen making coffee for the men in the solarium. The light over the bay had turned the particular shade of amber that comes before a long dusk. Aldred came in the way he always did, as though the room belonged to him, which she supposed it had until recently. He was a broad man, methodical, with close-cropped silver at his temples and the specific brand of pleasantness that people use in place of warmth. "Make it strong," he said. "Long night ahead for everyone." "You must be relieved, though. Your brother settled in over at St. Anthony's now, under Dr. Ferris's care. Good facility." Lyra's hand stilled on the kettle. She kept her face exactly as it was. She watched the steam rise from the spout. She counted silently to 3. "Very relieved," she said, and poured him a cup. The moment the kitchen door swung shut behind him, she set the kettle down with care. She would think about how steady her hands had been, later, and not be entirely sure what to make of it, and walked directly to the solarium. Caspian and Corvin looked up when she pushed through the door without knocking. "And is in Collingwood," she said, "at St. Anthony's under a Dr. Ferris. Is that right?" Caspian's face gave nothing away. "Who told you the facility name?" "You didn't." "No." "Corvin?" "No one in this house was given that name," Corvin said slowly. "Aldred just told me." She kept her voice level. "He said St. Anthony's and Dr. Ferris. He said he's been in the Situation Room all morning reviewing your communications logs. If the encrypted transfer orders contained those details." Caspian was already moving. What happened next was not something Lyra witnessed. She waited in the study again, hands folded in her lap, listening to the sounds of a house doing what it was built to do. Corvin found her 40 minutes later. "We need to change the logistics," he said. "The waterfront meeting point is compromised." Aldred fed Kincaid the details. "If we'd gone in at the dock as planned, we would have walked into a prepared position." He paused. "The boss is rerouting, because you caught it." She had caught it because Aldred had been careless, because he hadn't considered that she would notice the name of a hospital she had never been told, or understand what it meant that he knew it. He had looked at the cook and seen furniture. That had cost him everything. The Kincaid operation came apart over the course of a single night. The freight brokerage on the lakeshore, the communications building near the junction, the field coordinator reconsidering. Lyra sat in the study with the encrypted radio and listened to each transmission come through. The third one was wrong. "Rowe's vehicle ambush at the alternate rendezvous. He's hit." She was moving before the transmission finished. The estate had a medical room she had never been inside. A converted basement space that smelled of antiseptic and clean linen, with the kind of equipment that existed because some emergencies cannot be taken to a hospital. She found it by memory from a floor plan she had once seen framed outside the housekeeping office. She found the supply cabinets. She had 2 years of culinary training and the specific unflinching practicality that comes from growing up with a brother who believed every bicycle was a personal invitation to injury. She pulled on gloves. She laid out what she thought she would need. She waited. When the garage door opened and she heard the voices of men moving quickly, she walked out to meet them. Caspian was on his feet, which mattered more than anything else. He had one hand pressed to his left side, and the color in his face was considerably less than usual, but his eyes were clear and he was walking under his own power. "Put him on the table," she said, and something in her voice must have carried enough authority, because the two men supporting his arms complied without a word. "You don't have to," Caspian began. "I know I don't have to." She moved to the supply cabinet for trauma dressings. "Be quiet." He was quiet. The wound was a deep graze along his left flank, below the ribs. The bullet had not entered the body cavity. She confirmed it by pressing carefully and watching his face. He didn't flinch, but his eyes tracked every movement of her hands with an intensity she chose to find functional rather than unnerving. "Aldred gave them the alternate point as well," she said, working to clean the wound. "He gave them everything he had." Caspian's voice was controlled, measured. He'd been feeding the Kincaids for months. He wanted out of the organization. They offered him a clean exit in exchange for access. A pause. He looked at the staff roster and decided the cook was the easiest liability to ignore. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about that. His eyes stayed on her face. "You caught what my own men missed. Twice." She kept her attention on her work, pressed gauze, checked the wound edges. "You're bleeding on my floor," she said. Something moved in his expression, recognition, and something quieter beneath it. "My floor," he said carefully. "Your floor," she agreed. When she had finished and taped the dressing flat, he caught her wrist before she could step back. His grip was gentle, not restraining, just present, the kind of touch that asks rather than demands. "You asked me," he said, "whether I knew anything about the car that hit your brother." "You answered." "Not completely." His thumb pressed lightly against her pulse point. "The corporation was dissolved when the man who registered it died. He was one of mine. I did not know what he had done with it. I would have stopped it." He paused. "I'm telling you this because you are going to remain in this house, and I would prefer you understand the difference between what I have done and what was done in proximity to me." Lyra looked at him for a long moment. "Is that an apology?" "It is an explanation. I don't apologize for things I didn't do. I take responsibility for what I should have known." He held her gaze. "Those are different things." "That might be the most complicated version of sorry I have ever heard." The corner of his mouth moved barely, but she caught it. "Aiden's bills are gone," he said. "His care in Collingwood is covered indefinitely. He doesn't know by whom. That's how it stays." He released her wrist. "And you are no longer a cook in this house, Lyra. You are something else, something this house will learn to account for properly." She looked at the room around them, at the blood on her gloves and the white dressing taped neatly to his ribs, and the fluorescent light humming steadily above. She had arrived at this estate invisible. She had spent 8 months making herself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. She had done it for Aiden, and it had worked, and now it was over. "Get some rest," she said, pulling off the gloves. "You lost blood. The dressing needs to be changed in 6 hours." He inclined his head, the smallest possible gesture of a man unaccustomed to being told what to do and choosing, just this once, not to resist it. "You'll be here." It wasn't a question. It was the kind of certainty that a man like Caspian Rowe extended very carefully, to very few people. "I'll be here," she said. By the time the sun came up over Georgian Bay, the Kincaid faction had ceased to exist as a coherent organization. Caspian was resting in the east wing with a fresh dressing and a mug of tea on the nightstand, the study door standing open for the first time she could remember. And in the kitchen, her kitchen, she thought, for the first time without qualification, Lyra Macpherson was already at the counter, making breakfast for a house that had, without any particular ceremony, decided she was exactly where she was supposed to be.